The bitter winter wind of Pittsburgh rattled the glass doors of the neighborhood pharmacy, but inside a different kind of cold was seeping into Valerie's bones. She stood at the brightly lit counter, her trembling hands pressed flat against the synthetic wood grain, watching the pharmacist meticulously inspect the golden band. Mr. Peterson, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a mask of sheer indifference, held the delicate ring up to the harsh fluorescent lights. Valerie swallowed hard, feeling a bead of cold sweat trace its way down the back of her neck, despite the chill in the room. The boxes of antibiotics sat on the counter so incredibly close she could read the fine print, yet they felt entirely out of her reach. Mr. Peterson placed the small piece of jewelry onto a digital scale, tapped a few keys on his register, and let out a heavy, tired sigh. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and stated he could offer $200 for the piece, noting it was solid gold, but far too simple and lacking any precious stones. Valerie felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. $200. The medication for her severely ill children cost $250. She had completely miscalculated, or perhaps she had desperately deluded herself into believing that this ring, the sole physical memory of her husband Richard, who had died in a tragic construction accident 2 years ago, held greater worldly value. Tears welled in her eyes as she pleaded with the man, her voice cracking under the immense weight of a mother's desperation. She explained that her twin boys, Caleb and Ethan, who were only 5 years old, had been burning with a relentless fever for 3 days straight. The doctor at the free clinic had diagnosed a severe respiratory infection, warning her that their condition would rapidly deteriorate if they did not start the antibiotics that very evening. Her voice, thick with suppressed sobs, echoed slightly in the quiet store, causing a few customers waiting in line to avert their eyes in uncomfortable pity. Mr. Peterson simply shook his head impatiently, stating it was the best he could do, and suggesting she try another pawn shop if the offer did not suit her needs. Valerie knew with agonizing certainty that there was nowhere else to go. She had already exhausted 3 different pawn shops in the greater Pittsburgh area over the previous week, and all of them had offered even lesser amounts for the modest band. Closing her eyes, she tried to force back the tears, her mind flashing to the flushed, exhausted faces of her little boys, who were currently struggling to draw breath in their tiny bedroom. The sheer indignity of the situation threatened to crush her completely, and she prepared to beg to offer to clean the pharmacy floors for a month, anything to bridge the gap. Suddenly, a deep, authoritative voice sliced through the heavy air right behind her shoulder, demanding to know exactly how much money was missing. Valerie gasped and spun around, her heart plummeting into her stomach when she recognized the impeccably dressed man standing there. It was Matthew Smith, the wealthy owner of the large construction firm where she had been quietly working as a nighttime cleaning lady for the past 8 months. He stood there in his tailored wool coat, having seemingly materialized out of nowhere, bearing witness to her most profoundly humiliating moment. She tried to address him, to utter a respectful greeting, but the words died in her throat, instantly swallowed by a tidal wave of burning shame. Matthew stepped confidently up to the counter, his sharp gaze fixed squarely on the intimidated pharmacist, and repeated his question with a natural command that made Mr. Peterson immediately straighten his posture. The pharmacist nervously stammered that they were short $50, explaining that the lady wished to purchase antibiotics and cough syrups, but the pawn value of the gold band did not cover the total cost. Without a single second of hesitation, Matthew reached into the inner breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He instructed the pharmacist to charge the entire amount to his card and ordered him to return the wedding ring to Valerie immediately. Mr. Peterson blinked in sheer surprise, asking if the gentleman was absolutely certain about this generous gesture. Matthew placed his premium credit card firmly on the glass surface, his voice leaving no room for argument and told the man to also include the highest quality children's vitamins they had in stock. Valerie finally found her voice weakly protesting through her tears, insisting that she could not possibly accept such an enormous favor, and that he truly did not have to do this. Matthew turned to look at her, and for the very first time in 8 months of passing each other in the corporate hallways, she saw something far deeper than mere professional courtesy in his eyes. There was a fierce, protective intensity in his expression that rendered her completely speechless. He told her softly that her children needed to get well tonight, and that they would worry about the rest of the details later. The pharmacist hastily processed the transaction, packed the life-saving medications into a large paper bag, and slid the warm gold ring back across the counter. Valerie picked it up with shaking fingers, whispering a barely audible word of gratitude as Matthew smoothly took the heavy bag of medicine before she could even reach for it. He informed her that his car was idling right outside, stating he was taking her home in a tone that was less of a question and more of a comforting inevitability. The stark contrast between their two completely different realities had never been more painfully obvious to Valerie than when she sank into the heated leather passenger seat of Matthew's gleaming black sedan. Outside, the frozen city streets of Pittsburgh blurred past the tinted windows, a far cry from her usual exhausting routine of waiting at freezing bus stops and walking long blocks in the dark. Matthew had opened the door for her with a level of polite chivalry that only served to disorient her further, making her feel entirely out of place in his pristine world. Inside the quiet cabin, the silence was thick and palpable, save for the soft hum of the powerful engine and the gentle rush of warm air from the vents. Valerie kept her hands tightly clenched in her lap, her fingers curled protectively around her husband's ring, completely unable to slip it back onto her finger after coming so dangerously close to losing it forever. Matthew seamlessly navigated through the evening traffic, adjusting the rearview mirror before breaking the quiet tension to ask for her address. She provided the directions in a subdued voice, feeling the heavy weight of every syllable as she guided him toward Millvale, a modest working-class neighborhood located about 40 minutes away from the glittering downtown skyline. The geographical distance felt insignificant compared to the massive socioeconomic canyon separating the CEO from his cleaning staff, and she stared out the window praying the long drive would end quickly. Keeping his eyes focused on the icy road, Matthew spoke again, his tone remarkably gentle, as he asked how long the little boys had been suffering from their illness. Valerie clutched her purse tightly, explaining that it had started as a simple winter cold 3 days ago, but had rapidly escalated into something terrifying. She recounted the horror of the previous night, when Ethan began struggling for air, forcing her to rush them to an overcrowded public health clinic where they waited for hours. She admitted, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, that she had ultimately spent the very last of her rent money to secure a private consultation because the public queue was simply moving too slowly. Matthew furrowed his brow, absorbing the heavy burden she carried, and gently asked about the boy's father, prompting her to explain the tragedy of Richard's fatal accident on a poorly regulated construction site 2 years prior. He offered his deepest condolences, the raw sincerity in his voice catching her entirely off guard. He then gently questioned why she had never approached the company's human resources department for a salary advance, mentioning that they had specific employee assistance programs designed exactly for emergencies like this. Valerie lowered her gaze to her worn boots, confessing that she was terrified of becoming a nuisance, knowing all too well how difficult it was for a single mother to secure steady employment without being labeled as problematic. Matthew glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road, firmly stating that caring for desperately sick children was the definition of responsibility, not a problem. He went on to reveal that he had noticed her unparalleled work ethic, pointing out that she always arrived before the rest of the maintenance crew, and was consistently the last one to turn off the lights. Valerie was genuinely stunned, having always assumed she was entirely invisible to the men in the tailored suits who occupied the top floors of the building. Matthew softly added that he noticed a great many things, his words carrying a subtle, enigmatic weight that made her exhausted heart skip a sudden, unexpected beat. Before she could process the meaning behind his statement, they turned off the main avenue and slowly entered the narrow, tightly packed streets of her neighborhood. The imposing luxury vehicle stood out like a sore thumb among the small, aged houses of Millvale. But Matthew looked out the window with genuine curiosity, rather than the haughty disdain Valerie had braced herself to see. She pointed out a tiny, weather-beaten blue house with a white picket fence, noting that despite its humble appearance, she tried her best to keep the miniature front garden alive. Matthew smoothly parked the heavy car alongside the cracked curb and killed the engine, stepping out into the freezing air before she could even reach for her door handle. He retrieved the pharmacy bags and walked to her side, completely ignoring her anxious protests that her home was far too messy and humble for a man of his stature to enter. Matthew firmly insisted that he needed to ensure the boys were going to be all right, his unwavering determination leaving absolutely no room for debate or refusal. He kindly asked her to drop the formal titles and simply call him by his first name, as she nervously led him up the short concrete walkway. Before Valerie could even insert her key into the lock, the front door swung open to reveal Mrs. Rachel, her 60-year-old neighbor and trusted babysitter, whose deeply lined face was etched with sheer panic. The older woman gasped in relief at the sight of Valerie, urgently reporting that Caleb's fever had spiked dangerously high, and Ethan was caught in a relentless coughing fit. Mrs. Rachel stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes widening to the size of saucers as she finally noticed the incredibly tall, impeccably dressed stranger looming politely behind her young friend. Valerie quickly stumbled through a panicked introduction, explaining that this was her boss, Matthew, who had graciously driven her home and helped acquire the desperately needed medication. Without wasting another second on pleasantries, Valerie sprinted down the narrow hallway toward the back bedroom, with Matthew following closely on her heels. The room was tiny, barely holding two small twin beds pressed against the walls, where the little boys lay thrashing their faces, flushed a frightening shade of crimson as they fought for every single breath. Valerie instantly dropped to her knees on the worn carpet, right between the two small beds, frantically pressing her cool palms against her children's burning foreheads while whispering soothing promises that the medicine had finally arrived. Matthew stood in the doorway for a brief moment, observing the heartbreaking scene, feeling an unfamiliar profound ache expanding within his chest. There was such a massive, undeniable purity in her maternal devotion, a fierce love that completely eclipsed the poverty of their surroundings. Snapping out of his reverie, he swiftly moved to the small dresser, opened the pharmacy bag, and pulled out the bottles of liquid antibiotics and fever reducers, scanning the dosage instructions with intense focus. He asked Valerie if she had a proper measuring syringe, prompting her to dash to the kitchen and return seconds later with the necessary medical supplies. Matthew took the plastic syringe, his large hands surprisingly gentle and precise as he measured out the exact dosage of the thick pink liquid required for the boy's weight. He walked over to Caleb's bed, first kneeling down and introducing himself in a soft, rumbling voice as a friend of their mother who had brought a magic potion to make them strong again. Caleb fluttered his heavy eyelids open, offering a weak, trusting nod, before swallowing the medicine without a single complaint. Matthew repeated the careful process with Ethan waiting patiently through a coughing fit, before helping the boy take his medicine, followed by a dose of the fever reducer for both brothers. He checked his expensive wristwatch, mentally calculating the exact time the next dose would be required, and assured Valerie that the dangerous temperatures should begin to drop within a few hours. Standing up, he brushed a bit of lint from his slacks and instructed her to keep them hydrated, his presence filling the cramped room with an unexpected anchoring sense of absolute safety. Valerie leaned against the doorframe, tears freely sliding down her cheeks, as she watched this powerful, wealthy man care for her fatherless children with such profound, uncharacteristic tenderness. She whispered that she had absolutely no idea how to ever repay him, declaring that he had literally saved her boys from a terrible fate that evening. Matthew closed the distance between them, his expression softening as he gently corrected her, insisting that he had done nothing extraordinary and that any decent human being would have done the exact same thing. Valerie shook her head vehemently, arguing that most people would have simply looked the other way, and she bravely asked him why he had chosen to stop pay and drive her all the way to this side of the city. Matthew remained silent for a long moment, his gaze wandering over the cracked paint of the walls before looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. He confessed that he had stepped in because he saw a mother willing to sacrifice her most precious, irreplaceable memory just to keep her children breathing. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre, explaining that he saw immense courage, where anyone else would have only seen a tragic display of poverty and despair. Furthermore, he admitted that witnessing her struggle made him acutely aware of how shamefully little he actually knew about the dedicated people who kept his own company running day after day. Valerie felt a sudden frantic fluttering in her chest at his proximity, nervously murmuring that she always tried to remain invisible to avoid causing any disruptions at work. Matthew looked deeply into her eyes, declaring that it was high time she stopped hiding, and explicitly ordered her never to endure such terrifying hardships alone ever again. When she asked what he meant, he firmly stated that, from this night forward, if she ever needed anything, she was to come directly to his office without fear, without shame, and without hesitation. He paused, taking a slow breath as if gathering his courage, and added that he genuinely wanted to get to know her outside the confines of the office as a woman rather than just an employee. The silence that followed his bold declaration was heavy, thick, with a swirling mixture of terrified apprehension and a fragile, terrifyingly beautiful hope. Valerie nervously stammered that she wasn't sure if that was a wise idea, pointing out the vast, seemingly insurmountable differences between their respective worlds and social standings. Matthew readily agreed that their backgrounds were different, but softly countered that different did not automatically mean incompatible, reaching out to gently brush his fingers against her trembling arm. He completely shifted the subject. Then, catching her off guard by asking if she had ever considered returning to school to pursue a degree or a specialized career path. She admitted that she had always dreamed of attending nursing school because she loved healing people, but the lack of funds and the demands of raising twins alone had buried that dream completely. Matthew's eyes lit up as he explained that his company had partnerships with local universities, specifically mentioning a grant program that could easily cover her tuition for evening classes while he adjusted her work schedule. He passionately argued that she possessed incredible potential and simply lacked a fair opportunity, smiling warmly when she asked why he would go to such lengths for her. He replied that she had taught him a vital lesson about true value that day, and that everyone deserved a fighting chance to rise above their painful circumstances. With the boys finally settling into a peaceful, medicated sleep, Matthew bid her good night, leaving her standing in the hallway with a heart full of wild, impossible dreams. The following morning brought a quiet sense of relief as the pale winter sun filtered through the thin curtains of the bedroom, revealing that the boys' fevers had drastically broken overnight. Valerie meticulously administered their morning medication, prepared a warm bowl of oatmeal, and settled them on the living room rug, with their favorite animated television shows playing softly in the background. At exactly 9 o'clock, her outdated cellular phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, displaying a text message from an unknown number that inquired about the health of her two young champions. Mrs. Rachel, who had popped over with fresh coffee, noticed Valerie's blushing hesitation and teasingly urged her to reply to the handsome boss who had played the hero the night before. Valerie quickly typed out a polite response, confirming that the fever had subsided and expressing her endless gratitude once again for his miraculous intervention at the pharmacy. Matthew replied almost instantly, expressing his deep relief and reminding her that she had the entire day off with full pay, strictly instructing her to rest alongside her recovering children. The simple, unprompted display of care sent a warm flush through her chest, making her realize how utterly exhausted she had been from carrying the weight of the world entirely alone for 2 years. Later that afternoon, Matthew called her directly, his deep voice crackling through the cheap speaker, asking if it would be intrusive if he dropped by after 7 o'clock in the evening to bring some supplies. Despite her initial protests that he had already done more than enough, the subtle hope in his tone broke down her defenses, and she found herself agreeing to his evening visit. When the clock struck 7, the heavy black sedan pulled up to the curb once more, and Matthew emerged carrying 3 large canvas grocery bags, looking strikingly handsome, without his customary tie, and with his crisp sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He greeted her with a bright, disarming smile, stepping into the small house and immediately dropping to one knee to present the boys with colorful memory games and beautifully illustrated storybooks. Caleb and Ethan, looking significantly more energetic than the previous night, eagerly accepted the gifts, their faces lighting up as this towering man sat cross-legged on the floor to explain the rules of the game. Valerie watched from the kitchen threshold, her heart squeezing painfully as she observed the genuine, unforced delight Matthew took in entertaining her fatherless sons. Eventually, he stood up and carried the heavy grocery bags into the cramped kitchen, unpacking fresh poultry, organic vegetables, milk eggs, and an assortment of high-quality staples she could rarely afford. When she nervously protested this overwhelming charity, he gently touched her shoulder, framing the groceries as a simple advance on her salary, so she would never have to choose between buying dinner and buying medicine again. To lighten the emotional weight of the moment, he rolled up his sleeves a bit higher and boldly challenged her to let him help cook dinner, claiming he possessed hidden culinary talents. They stood side by side in the narrow kitchen, the space so tight their arms frequently brushed, as Valerie prepared the rice, and Matthew somewhat clumsily chopped the fresh vegetables. The initial awkwardness quickly melted away, replaced by an easy, flowing conversation where Valerie shared stories of her rural childhood and her long-buried passion for the medical field. In turn, Matthew let his guarded corporate walls crumble, quietly confessing that he had lost his own father when he was only 15 years old, thrusting him into the terrifying position of caring for his chronically ill mother. He admitted that he intimately understood the gnawing, suffocating fear of going to sleep, terrified of losing the people you love most, a revelation that forever changed how Valerie perceived him. They ate dinner together at the small, wobbly kitchen table, the boys eagerly devouring the meal and enthusiastically complimenting Matthew's vegetable chopping skills, which earned a loud, echoing laugh from the CEO. Once the children were tucked safely into bed, Valerie and Matthew sat on the faded living room sofa, maintaining a respectful distance, though the emotional space between them had vanished. Matthew brought up his previous invitation, formally asking if she would allow him to take her out for a proper dinner once the children were entirely fully recovered. Valerie stared at her hands, voicing her deep-seated fear of the vicious office gossip, specifically mentioning Brenda, the notoriously sharp-tongued receptionist, and how rumors could ultimately jeopardize her vital employment. Matthew listened intently, his expression hardening slightly as he firmly assured her that he would never allow anyone in his building to treat her with anything less than absolute respect. He promised that they could be as discreet as she wished, dining in quiet neighborhoods far away from the corporate downtown district, ensuring her professional dignity remained completely intact. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stated that the only fear he harbored was the fear of walking away and spending the rest of his life wondering what could have been. The raw, unfiltered honesty in his deep voice resonated within her very soul, slowly melting the thick armor she had spent 2 grueling years building around her shattered heart. Valerie finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze, and admitted that she was terrified of trusting a man again, after Richard's death had left her drowning in grief and crippling debt. Matthew reached out gently, covering her trembling hand with his warm palm, solemnly vowing that while he could not predict the future, he would never play reckless games with her heart or the safety of her children. He promised to earn their trust day by day, proving his worth through consistent actions rather than empty words asking only for a single chance to show her how a real partnership felt. Breathing a shaky sigh of surrender, Valerie softly agreed to the date, feeling a terrifying yet exhilarating spark of genuine hope ignite in the darkest corners of her mind. True to his word, Matthew arrived the very next afternoon, carrying a sleek leather folder stuffed with colorful brochures from local nursing programs and community colleges. He had pulled a few strings, reaching out to an old colleague named Dr. Harrison, who directed a highly respected evening nursing program specifically designed for working adults. They sat at the small kitchen table armed with a calculator and notepads, spending hours mapping out a realistic schedule that balanced her cleaning shifts, her coursework, and her duties as a mother. Matthew demonstrated how the company's educational grant would cover the bulk of the tuition, and he insisted on personally supplementing Mrs. Rachel's income so the older woman could comfortably babysit during evening classes. Seeing the intimidating financial numbers shrink into manageable monthly goals profoundly shifted something inside Valerie. For the first time in her adult life, she was not just surviving, but actively planning a future. When Matthew left to allow her time to get ready for their date, Valerie felt a nervous energy bubbling in her stomach, rushing to her closet to find something suitable. She pulled out a simple, elegant navy blue dress she had not worn since Richard's funeral, carefully styling her hair and applying a subtle touch of lipstick to bring color back to her exhausted face. Mrs. Rachel arrived promptly at 6, bringing a plate of fresh-baked cookies for the boys and offering Valerie a warm, encouraging hug, telling her she absolutely deserved every ounce of this newfound happiness. At exactly 7:30, the doorbell rang, and Valerie opened the door to find Matthew standing on the porch looking breathtakingly handsome in a casual button-down shirt and tailored jeans, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. He looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe, whispering that she looked incredibly beautiful, before greeting the boys and promising them a weekend trip to the park very soon. They drove to a quiet, warmly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, a place known for its excellent comfort food and secluded wooden booths that offered perfect privacy. The atmosphere was incredibly relaxed, completely devoid of the suffocating pretension Valerie had feared, allowing her to finally let her guard down and truly enjoy the evening. Over plates of roasted chicken and warm pie, they talked for hours, moving past their initial shared traumas to discuss their favorite books, terrible movies, and secret dreams. Valerie found herself laughing loudly, her eyes crinkling at the corners, as Matthew recounted disastrous corporate meetings and embarrassing mistakes he had made during his early days as a young executive. He possessed a remarkable ability to listen deeply, maintaining eye contact, and asking thoughtful questions that made Valerie feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. The massive divide of wealth and status that had initially terrified her seemed to evaporate completely within the confines of that wooden booth, leaving only two people genuinely fascinated by one another. When he finally drove her home, the Pittsburgh streets were blanketed in a quiet, peaceful darkness, the only sound the soft crunch of tires against the icy pavement. Matthew walked her to the front door, pausing under the dim yellow light of the porch, the freezing winter air creating small clouds of white vapor with every breath they took. He reached out his fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, reiterating his promise that they would take this journey as slowly as she needed, without any pressure or rush. Valerie looked up into his eyes, reading the absolute sincerity written there, and found herself leaning slightly forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Matthew closed the remaining distance, cupping her cheek with a warm hand, and kissed her with a slow, agonizingly gentle reverence that sent shock waves of warmth straight down to her toes. It was a kiss built on profound respect and unspoken promises, a deliberate sealing of a pact that completely erased the lingering ghosts of her tragic past. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, he whispered against her forehead that he desperately wanted this to be the first of many beautiful nights together. Valerie smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that illuminated her face, whispering back that she was finally ready to stop being afraid and start embracing whatever beautiful chaos lay ahead. 6 months flew by in a whirlwind of late-night studying, quiet weekend dates, and a slowly blossoming, deeply rooted love that transformed every aspect of Valerie's demanding life. She had officially started her nursing program under Dr. Harrison's guidance, proving to be a brilliant and fiercely dedicated student fueled by the relentless desire to build a better life for Caleb and Ethan. Her relationship with Matthew remained a closely guarded secret at the construction firm, but the subtle, loving glances they exchanged in the hallways provided her with endless strength during her grueling shifts. Furthermore, Matthew had seamlessly integrated himself into the boys' lives, becoming a steadfast father figure who spent his weekends helping with school projects and teaching them how to ride bicycles in the park. Eventually, they decided to introduce their worlds to one another, starting with a lively summer barbecue at Matthew's sprawling estate, where Mrs. Rachel and the twins ran freely through the massive manicured gardens. Valerie met his inner circle of friends who welcomed her with genuine warmth, completely dismissing her fears of judgment and proving that Matthew had surrounded himself with people who valued character over bank accounts. 2 grueling but immensely rewarding years passed, marked by Valerie's exhausting clinical rotations, endless exams, and her eventual promotion to an administrative assistant role at the firm, championed surprisingly by Brenda, who had grown to deeply respect her. Through every sleepless night and moments of overwhelming self-doubt, Matthew was her unwavering anchor, brewing coffee at midnight, quizzing her on medical terminology, and fiercely protecting her peace of mind. The day Valerie finally walked across the university stage to accept her nursing diploma, the auditorium erupted in deafening cheers from her small but fiercely loyal cheering section. Matthew, sitting proudly in the very front row, beside a weeping Mrs. Rachel, and the wildly cheering twins, beamed with a level of pride that rivaled his greatest corporate achievements. She looked radiant in her white uniform, holding the heavy parchment that represented a complete rewrite of her family's destiny, knowing she had earned every single letter of her new title. After the ceremony, Matthew hosted a beautiful, intimate celebration at his home, stringing fairy lights across the patio and hiring a small band to play joyful music into the warm evening. Halfway through the party, Matthew tapped a spoon against his crystal glass, drawing the attention of the gathered guests as he wrapped a loving arm around Valerie's waist. He spoke eloquently about a cold winter night at a local pharmacy, recounting the heartbreaking image of a fiercely devoted mother prepared to trade her most precious memory for her children's survival. His voice thickened with emotion as he declared that witnessing her sacrifice had forever changed his understanding of true wealth, and that her strength had illuminated the darkest corners of his own life. Without warning, he stepped back, dropping to one knee right there on the stone patio, and reached into his pocket to produce a small velvet box containing a stunning, brilliant diamond ring. Matthew looked up at her, tears shimmering in his eyes, and asked the brilliant, resilient woman standing before him if she would do him the ultimate honor of becoming his wife and building a forever family. Valerie covered her mouth, sobbing tears of absolute unfiltered joy as she looked at Caleb and Ethan, who were jumping up and down screaming for her to say yes. She nodded vigorously, uttering a breathless agreement as he slid the exquisite ring onto her finger, sealing the promise with a passionate kiss while their friends and family cheered wildly. Later, as they danced slowly under the twinkling lights, she rested her head against his chest, realizing she had never needed to sell her past in order to secure a beautiful future. As the music played softly in the background, Valerie leaned against her new fiancé, reflecting on the arduous journey that had brought them here. She realized that life, with all its bitter winds and crushing weights, often pushes us to the very edge of our endurance, forcing us to make agonizing sacrifices for those we cherish. Yet it is precisely in our darkest, most desperate moments when we are willing to surrender our most treasured possessions out of pure, selfless love that destiny quietly intervenes. The universe has a profound way of rewarding relentless resilience and unwavering devotion. We learn that genuine humanity still thrives in the hearts of strangers, and that compassion can bridge the vastest divides of wealth and social standing. No matter how deep the scars of the past may be, or how insurmountable the present hurdles appear, maintaining faith in the goodness of others can illuminate paths we never knew existed. Ultimately, our greatest strength lies not in enduring hardship alone, but in having the courage to open our hearts again, allowing love, empathy, and community to heal our deepest wounds and rewrite the chapters of our lives with hope and lasting grace.